So last night I watched the documentary with Louie Theroux and about the Manosphere, and it was a fascinating, sad, hard, triggering watch. If I'm really honest, as a man who works with grown men and works with young boys and sees the impact of these views go well beyond just TikTok and Instagram and likes and views. I think what's really obvious with the three men that he speaks to consistently throughout is that really their whole thing is about amassing money, first of all, attention, because attention leads to money, and to some degree fame, to insulate them from the difficulties of life that they've experienced. Again, when you go through the three men, I can never remember the guy's name, the guy from Louisiana. He talks about his very chaotic upbringing, right, which is traumatizing. Ultimately, if you feel your mother's tried to burn your house down twice, you probably don't trust in life. You don't probably feel very safe, and you want to control things, relationship in particular, but particularly women, if that's the chaotic life you've grown up in. And then you've got HS, whose father was a famous rugby player who just ignored him, right? So there's these big gaping holes of what it means to be a man, and what it looks like to be a man. And what you're seeing is these men, these influencers, businessmen, whatever you want to call them, right? Are they using their own pain to kind of connect with the pain that many young men and boys are also feeling, right? That there's a lack of role model, of obvious role model, or lack of a clear way of being to be a man, to amass the fame or amass at least the respect, the money, the power that they deeply desire, because they feel powerless. Because underneath it all, what you really see is the three of them, there's a powerlessness they feel. Like you see with HS in particular, he's quite a control freak. He he spirals. He tries to pretend that he's kind of superior to Louis, right? But actually, you see time and time again that once he starts to, try and be superior with Louis asks him questions that really poke holes in his mentality, in his mindset, and so forth. And this is where these guys are really dangerous, is because they're saying things that they don't really believe, right? They're saying things on camera they don't really believe and necessarily agree with or want to follow through in their own life, purely for the sake of attention. It's like the equivalent of acting. It's a bit like, I don't know, reality TV, right? What we're seeing with these guys, they're giving the image of this life, but actually the life that they're portraying, they're not living. So you look at Myron, for example. It appears obvious that he can't hold down a healthy relationship. He can't be, talks about wanting to have multiple wives, but gets annoyed with Louis because Louis talks about that to his current girlfriend, and then backtracks midway through the conversation. He's not kind of rooted in being like, hey, yeah, I've had this conversation with my partner and she's on board. It's like he's trying to sneak it in the back door, right? In the same way that, someone who's a bit immature in a relational sense would do. And I see this again, as I work with men in relationship. I've seen men do exactly this before. They want an open relationship and they can't just go, hey, this is what I want. If that's not what you want, that's okay. That's fine. But underneath it all is what you're seeing in these men is a powerlessness, an anger towards the world, and a desire to control, to create safety through control. As human beings, when we don't feel safe, we try and create control. And obviously, I think Louis does a decent job of like picking holes in some of their logic and some of the things they say in this very kind of deadpan way. And imagine, he's done a lot of documentaries with killers and murderers in prisons. So he doesn't appear to be particularly intimidated by them, which is something that in ways endears him to them, but also frustrates them. You can see at times they're trying to like intimidate or impress him in some way, because you remember these boys, these men, they lacked a male role model who was maybe as steadfast as Louis was and was as challenging as Louis was. So they both desire that experience, but they're also scared of it because they never had it, right? And they're trying to embody it now. And I think I've got some notes down here. I think one of the things that I didn't like about the documentary, and I understand why it's maybe shot in this way, is that it shows this very cashed up, glamorous end of this kind of iceberg of the manosphere, right? It picks these three guys. Is it three? I think I've missed someone out. He's Sneeko. He's got the guy from Louisiana. Actually, four. He's got Myron and he's got HS, right? It's all kind of the glamorous end. They're in New York, they're in Miami, they're in Marbella, there's supercars, like it's all looking super squish and super cool. And what I feel that he missed the trick on Louis in the documentary in general was taking this into the grounded reality of what's occurring, like putting in front of some of these guys, like, you say this stuff and these are young boys that go into school and they say it to their teachers, or they say it to their mums, and they say it to the women on the street, and it leads to sexual violence, rape, harassment, all these things. Like, how do you feel about that? And obviously it's clear from the documentary that when Louis does challenge them in some of these ways, they're like, it's not my problem, it's the parents' fault. And I find that really interesting with HS in particular, because like his mum's in there and his mum obviously doesn't agree with his points of view. And I think it's quite sad the way she tackles that to some degree. She's like, oh, well, no parent agrees, no parent and child agree with all their points of view. But it's like, that's, talking about where they're going to live or how they're going to raise their kids. Like, your child's online, right, spouting deeply sexist, racist, homophobic stuff. And you're just like, well, kids will be kids. And I can look at that as someone who grew up in a single parent household and say that's a really weak portrayal of a mother, right? And I'm not blaming her, but I am actually, some of the responsibility lies with her, if I'm honest, right? Because you can't say your child ends up like that and it's not your responsibility, because it is. They're your child. I have a child now, and I will die on the hill of how he turns out in life is definitely my responsibility. So I think it's really sad in that way. I think there should have definitely been more showing to these men of the impact of their actions, because you can see with HS is spiraling into violence, right? He's just doing whatever he can to create more notoriety, to be seen and paid attention to. And this isn't new in history, right? This is something that's happened for decades, right? But now with social media, there's less regulation. You can just go and do these things yourself. And also, like I said, it didn't touch on these attitudes of how this stuff gets into schools, how it's touching 13-year-old boys, right? How there's so much hypocrisy and moral corruption amongst these men. And I think they do show the moral corruption. And I think that's a good thing, because, if you're a 20-year-old man and you watch this and you follow these guys, you're going to see that these men have no integrity, right? In particular, I keep going to HS because I think he's the one that stuck out the most, maybe because he's also British, but like the way in which he really is scamming people. He's just going to get you into his Telegram group and get you on these platforms that we all know are just dodgy trading platforms for him to make a cut. He doesn't care. The donut example where he's like, he has OnlyFans girls and trying to kind of, we'll call it, help them sell their services inside his group, while also saying, here's my fitness plans. And he says, well, I'm making money on either side of where they go. But you see the moral decay and corruption that exists in that. It's like, Louis says, why don't you just do good things, for the sake of being good? And he's just like, he can't fathom that, because he can't see how being good can lead to him being happy, or being good can lead to him actually amassing the wealth he can. And this is probably a sign, really, it points to, when we look at the wider world that we live in, we look at our politics, we look at our politicians, we look at our businesses, right? And even we can start to ask, do we look in our homes, right? Individually, how we lie, we swindle, we bend rules and so forth. This is the impact on the children who grow into men. We lack morals in certain areas. And if our family unit lacks morals, then you're showing your child how to be, right? And you see in the way they are, there's just like a lack of moral or care for other people. And I want to touch on Myron, because I don't follow him particularly, but it was very interesting to see him doing the filming, but also to see his paranoia around Louis, right? You can see how edgy he was about Louis being in his space and so forth. But, Louis does a very good job of just being like, I'm asking questions, I'm interested, I'm curious about you, right? Which is almost in a way that a therapist would almost be. And then from time to time, Louis would, asked a question that kind of nitpicked at something. And, I like the way that when he was talking to Angela, and he's like, oh, I can see the pain in Angela's eyes. It's a very subtle way to say, actually, you're hurting this woman, without accusing him of hurting this woman, if you get what I mean. I know a lot of you might be like, oh, he should be stronger. But also that's not how he is in his documentaries, as far as I know. So I think, and then the part where Myron brings young influencers into his studio to form a podcast, which is a really disgusting thing to do, right? Because he's basically creating a podcast where he brings in women of a certain kind of age and maturity, because they're all young, 18, 19 year old influencers. Him as a 30-year-old man, And then he belittles them on camera, which reinforces the ideas he has about women and reinforces those ideas to the listeners as well, which is equally really dangerous because he's just doing this reinforcing. But actually, it's not a fair fight, right? He's not sitting there with 30-year-old journalists or professors of various neuroscience or whatever, right? Women. He's not fighting a fair fight with women of his age and even his mental capacity, right? So he's basically staging this whole thing for clout, you know. And I think it's interesting that HS used that word. You know, why did you do that thing with Bonnie Blue? He was like clout, and like I said this to also when we watched it is how many of the podcast world in general, right, have guests on their podcast purely for clout, purely for the numbers that they have, right? Like, or, you know, if you're an influencer and you listen to this, how often do you put out posts that are probably harmful to people, whether they're man hating, woman hating, belittling of dating, blah, 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 but you do it because you know you're going to get engagement. That's the clout piece, right? And the dangers of just following clout are really shown in this like documentary, because all of what's happening is simply to get attention and to make money, right? That's the center of all of this. This is what these guys are about. So I'm just, you know, there's a real like lack of maturity. There's a volatility, and I wonder where this kind of social media influencer side of things is going to go, because things just feel they're getting more and more extreme in terms of views and the things you have to do to get people's attention. You have to create more and more rage or more and more outrage, right? And you know, people go, "Oh, just doing it for the gram," but it's actually a dangerous way to go. And I feel this documentary just highlights like what happens when humans have a kind of social experiment, which is kind of social media, and our attention becomes commoditized, you know, and how we respond, because we don't respond consciously as adults, as children, because you're just seeing these young men being influenced by men who are barely men, who are immature, who are relationally, you know, from a relational point of view, don't have the skills to create healthy, loving relationships. You know, like you're taking advice, it's like the blind leading the blind, basically, you know. But because the first blind person has big muscles, the blind young boys, they think that they should listen. And it's just showing that there's huge vacuum that's occurred in the place of what would have been normal role models, which should have been anything from teachers to football coaches to, you know, the man down the road, where we would have normally got this kind of masculine guidance from. And it's been outsourced into social media, where a person can make themselves appear to be something that they really aren't, because they're just living on highlight reels and a little bit of streaming here and there. And it's like, it's the reality of being with, you know, good men and having good men around you versus the appearance of this wealth, these flashy lives that appeals to so many young boys, because they don't feel like they're attractive, right? The you know, when they're young boys, some of them, they're attracted to young girls, and those young girls don't pick them. They pick the attractive boys, or they pick the popular boys at school, right? We've all been there. We've had that experience. We know it happens. Or the young boys, they don't feel they're smart. They don't think they're going to have these aspirations that they can meet. They don't want to get jobs and so forth. And some of that is on the economic situation of the world. And like, you know, the people, not my age, but the people older and who have power are also responsible for this, of creating this huge vacuum, right, of opportunity that is starting to happen in the world. And so it makes for grim viewing. But I really feel like they missed a trick in not bringing some footage in of schools, of teachers, to ground this kind of like almost Hollywood aspirational lifestyle with the grounded existence. Like I would have loved Louie to go, Elaine, HS's mum, and go, hey, let me take you to your local comprehensive school and see the impact of your son's content. Like let's show you, as this boy's mum, what the impact is of your son's attitudes and ways of being online, and how that's hitting women your age or people that have children just like you do. As I think that would have hit home really hard, and I think that's a part of it that is missing, because when we keep things up in this glamorous world, it's like talking about Epstein and making it in this like powerful man thing. it kind of seems beyond us, and we kind of go, yeah, you know, we can't connect to it. But when you remember that, like, you know, there's some research that come out said the amount of kind of child porn and child abuse and videos that are circling in the main three countries that are viewing them are the UK, the US, and Australia, it brings it into the ground of like, oh god, that's everyday men, right, and everyday boys. And I think this is what we're seeing as the problem. Everyday boys are being really impacted by these attitudes, and what we're seeing is a real gulf of, you know, fathers, men around them that they can look up to, and also us maybe not pointing them towards good men, you know, like parents being too busy. You know, there's a lot of things that like I said, I grew up in the space of not having that male role model, so I know what that's like, and I definitely went off the rails at times in my life, looking for answers and looking for certainty when you've grown up in what can feel like chaos and poverty. You know, you look to people who have the things you want as examples, and it's difficult, I imagine, for parents now, because these guys can wield so much power and take so much of your children's time, and they can just say whatever they want, right? Because they don't have to follow up with actual disciplining of your child. No one, you know, they don't try and have integrity. So if you haven't watched it, I really highly recommend watching it, especially if you have children, especially if you have sons, especially if you know, you feel disturbed or annoyed about this stuff. I think is an important watch.